after we got to Topaz, Utah, people realized who Fred was. He felt very lonely there at Topaz. He was working digging ditches. They were building a hospital, and the crew was very cold to him. Some people had this terrible feeling that Fred thought he was different than the rest of us Japanese Americans, and so they sort of shunned him.
The case Korematsu takes a man born in the United States and the legal treatment of him following Pearl Harbor, which begins with a declaration of war the next day, fears on the West Coast, the identification of a military protection area, the issuance by President Roosevelt of an executive order permitting and directing the military to take every possible protective measure against sabotage, including the exercise of the power to exclude. Next comes legislation, which includes the power to exclude and the definition of the crime for which Fred is ultimately convicted. General John DeWitt, the head of the military area that's been identified in California, then begins to promulgate a series of orders, the first of which is the curfew, which becomes the legal issue the Supreme Court resolves in the Hirabayashi case. The next order is the so-called exclusion order, which beyond the curfew directs people of Japanese American descent to leave the protected military area, which includes the entire state of California, by a process that begins with them reporting to these relocation centers. Fred Korematsu is, in that legal framework of orders, apprehended, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. His appeal travels from the court that convicted him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, briefly to the Supreme Court, back to the Ninth Circuit, and then to the Supreme Court for the decision we know as Korematsu. This case was argued in the fall of 1944 to a bench that included Robert H. Jackson. He, too, was a son of this country, born in this region in 1892, across the border of this state, just below the line in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania. He grew up in Frewsburg, New York, and then as a young man in Jamestown, New York. Now, Jackson goes to the Supreme Court before the war starts. In 1941, he's there when Pearl Harbor is bombed. He's a Roosevelt loyalist. He's a fervent patriot. He, too, is determined to do his part for a government of a nation at war. And indeed, he offers to President Roosevelt his willingness to leave the court at any time, should the president wish to use him in some other capacity as part of the military effort. He also, it is fair to say, was a man who, through that point in his life, had had very little contact with persons of Japanese ancestry. The first case arising out of the internment story that comes to the court on which Jackson sits is the Hirabayashi case. The court narrows the issue there and resolves it as a curfew question and unanimously upholds the curfew order. Jackson is one of the 9, despite misgivings, does vote, and is part of the unanimous decision to uphold it. The Ninth Circuit affirmance of Fred Korematsu's conviction occurs in December of 1943. When the Supreme Court is asked to review the case, Jackson is one of the votes to take it, seeing a serious constitutional issue. When the briefing occurs in the spring and through the summer of 1944, Jackson apparently is already at work doing his own investigation and background reading, including wide reading in American history. In October of 1944, the case is argued, and on Saturday, October 16, the justices meet and have their conference and vote on the case. The vote, we now know from historical materials, is 5-4 against Fred Korematsu. The opinion of the majority affirming Mr. Korematsu's conviction is assigned to Justice Hugo Black. For Jackson, Hirabayashi was it. The curfew decision was as far as he would go, and his opinion says no further. It is unconstitutional, he wrote, to do more than a curfew, and civilian government should not let the military order a court to do more than that. The final vote becomes 6-3. Jackson's dissenting opinion and the court's opinion come down in December of 1944. Not coincidentally, that's after President Roosevelt's final re-election in November of 1944. Jackson's dissent is a very complex argument. To digest it most briefly here, I'll focus on a couple of aspects. The first is the blatant racism of the military orders to which Mr. Korematsu was subjected. Jackson says the constitutional order of this country does not permit a criminal law based on race, and that's all we have here. And the Constitution of this country does not permit the transplanting of people based simply on ethnic, racial, genetic heritage distinctions. The court construes the issue more narrowly, frankly, than the dissenters. The dissenters decide internment is unconstitutional. The majority, as the movie pointed out so accurately, simply says the military's able to do what the military says it needs to do. That decision is followed very swiftly by the rescinding of the internment orders by President Roosevelt. And here's how I think that connects back to the Jackson dissent. After identifying the racism and the unconstitutionality of this, Jackson focuses uniquely among all the 9 justices on the relative lack of power in the judiciary to deal with an issue of military conduct. Jackson says we shouldn't debase the name of the Constitution by blessing what the military is doing here. But we also shouldn't pretend that we, the justices, will be able to stop the military in a situation of war. At least as against us in the judiciary, the military is going to do what the military is going to do, unless civilian government, the elected branches, the democratic powers of this country, rein a military in. That will be hard in war. It becomes more possible as war recedes. But that is where the hope of the constitutional order resides. In the meantime, don't throw the label constitutional on conduct like that. And not coincidentally, that message from Jackson about the democratic order is followed very quickly by the Roosevelt rescission of internment. For Robert Jackson, Korematsu, the case, and its issues remain powerful and proud moments. There are 3 little nuggets I'd point you to. One is a beautiful, unusual letter that he saved in his papers. It's dated April 1945, so it's more than 4 months after the decision, and its dateline is the Philippines. It is from a lieutenant serving in the Pacific Theater who says, in the fighting common language of the time, I know Japs. I've fought Japs. I've killed Japs. I've shot at Japs, and I've been shot at by Japs. But I'm also a lawyer. And in today's overseas mail package, I received the U.S. law reports, the first page of which contains Korematsu. And I read this opinion, and I am shocked that our Supreme Court did what it did. And I want you to know, Mr. Justice Jackson, that your dissenting opinion and the votes of your colleagues on the dissenting side of this argument are exactly the attack on the racialism that our side is fighting for in this war. A second nugget is Robert Jackson's own work at Nuremberg. He leaves less than 6 months after the Korematsu decision to do his post-war part in bringing legal accountability to racial behavior. And various pieces of the Nuremberg record show that Korematsu is a word that's used with meaning in the Nuremberg context. A third nugget is a little list he writes on a letter he gets from a college senior. In 1952, she writes him, a Smith College senior, and says, I'm writing my senior thesis, and I'd like to write it about you, and I'd like to write it about civil liberties. Which opinions are most emblematic of your views on civil liberties? And Jackson, presumably immediately as he's reading his mail, takes the cap off his pen and writes, Korematsu. And of course, it's right there in the opinion. Let me read you one paragraph. There is no suggestion that apart from the matter involved here, he is not law-abiding and well-disposed. Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born, and where all his life he has lived. Let me read that phrase again. Being in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born, and where all his life he has lived. That's a line that Robert Jackson wrote about Fred Korematsu, but I think most clearly it's a line Robert Jackson wrote about himself, about every American citizen, about himself in Chautauqua County, about us on this soil. Thank you.